What's up guys, this is TheKephas, and in this video I am going to showcase some macros that I have created for World of Warcraft with the use of a mod called Gnome Sequencer Enhanced. This mod allows you to create macros that can perform most, if not all, of your rotation with one button, which can be extremely useful for individuals like myself who have a disability, or for those who just want to be lazy. But you are still required to press buttons, control your character, and make choices, which means that using this mod does not violate the terms of service. Today we will be talking about Enhancement Shamans, but before we can understand how the macros work, let's first take a look at how the class is played. Enhancement Shamans can generate a resource called Maelstrom. You can generate 25 Maelstrom with Rockbiter. Rockbiter has 2 charges with a 6-second cooldown, so use it whenever it's available to build up your Maelstrom, but be sure not to overcap. Flame Tongue deals damage to your target, but it also empowers your weapons to deal extra fire damage for 16 seconds. Use Flame Tongue enough to keep your weapons empowered. Feral Spirit allows you to summon 2 Spirit Wolves to fight alongside you for 15 seconds, but you can only summon them once every 2 minutes. You also have an ability called Storm Strike, which you want to use on cooldown. Normally, Storm Strike will cost you 40 Maelstrom, but your weapon attacks have a small chance to activate Stormbringer, which resets the cooldown of Storm Strike and causes its next cast to only consume 20 Maelstrom and not trigger a cooldown. And lastly, you can spend any excess Maelstrom on Lava Lash. Use this to avoid overcapping your Maelstrom. For multiple target situations, you can pretty much do the exact same thing, except you can also use Crash Lightning whenever it's available. And that's a basic rundown on how to play an Enhancement Shaman. So now that we understand how the class works, let's take a look at the macro itself. We type /GS here, and you can see there is one macro for enhancement for both single target and for AoE. And of course, we're going to manage Lava Lash separately, and we'll get into why here in a second. But now let's right click on the macro. We can peek under the hood and see what it's all about. You can see that it is a priority macro, which means it's going to follow this list in priority, and when one of these abilities is on cooldown, it's going to move on to the next one, which is really great because Enhancement Shamans are very easy to macro, and the reason being is because there are so many abilities that use cooldowns, which makes it extremely simple to macro. So it's going to use Feral Spirit on cooldown, and then it's going to use Earthen Spike if you've taken that talent. Storm Strike is next. It's going to use that whenever it's off cooldown, which means that if the proc happens, it's going to use it. And it's going to prioritize it over all of the other abilities that follow it, which is really good. Following that up with Flame Tongue. Now Flame Tongue is a dot, and it's also a cooldown, which is very unique because normally dot abilities don't have cooldowns, which is why they're almost always impossible to macro. This one does have a cooldown. Now the cooldown is shorter than the actual dot, especially if you have more haste, but it's going to keep that dot up on your target at all times, and it's going to use that ability on cooldown, so at least you're never going to not have the dot on your target. Now, if you think that it's using Flame Tongue too often, it needs to wait a little bit longer for that dot to tick down, you can always remove Flame Tongue from the macro and manage it separately, but it is easy to just leave it in and let it do its thing. So it's up to you. Follow that up with Windsong and Sundering, which are both talents, which will be used on cooldown if you've taken those talents. And then the one that I kind of debated with a little bit, Crash Lightning. Now there was a time when Crash Lightning was generally something you used all the time, but now the tiers have changed and things are a little bit differently, so Crash Lightning necessarily isn't always used, you know, on single target, but it is good to use on AoE. So depending on your situation, you might choose to not use Crash Lightning on single target, especially depending on what your gear is, what your talents are, that kind of thing. So if you don't like Crash Lightning being used at all times, you can easily just remove it from the macro, put it on a separate button, and manage it separately. That being said, for any ability. And then lastly, when everything else isn't available, we're going to use Rockbiter, and it's going to use that all the time. It's going to keep that ability on cooldown, and it's going to generate your Maelstrom. And so, like I said, the reason why we want to use Lava Lash separately is because we don't want to Maelstrom starve ourselves so that we can't have enough to cast these other abilities. So generally, you're going to keep Lava Lash on a button by itself, and you're going to keep using it to keep yourself from overcapping Maelstrom, and then you're just going to spam this macro and have it use all of your other abilities when they are available. And then, of course, we also have our cooldowns here. Doom Winds and Ascendance if you've taken that talent, and Blood Fury. Of course, if you don't like the macro managing your cooldowns, like anything else, you can easily just remove them from the macro. Now, as for the talents that I've chosen, generally there isn't too much to be said about them. Most of the cooldown talents like Windsong, like Sundering, and even Ascendance, which is a cooldown, they're all included in the macro, but there are some cases where you have abilities that the macro can't manage. For example, Hailstorm brings Frostbrand into the macro, and if you use this talent, you're going to have to manage Frostbrand separately because of how it works. That also works for Fury of Air. You can't put that in the macro, and that also works for Lightning Bolt, which is brought in through Overcharge. If you use Overcharge, you're going to have to manage Lightning Bolt separately, and it's pretty much straightforward. Otherwise, all of these talents are going to do just what they would normally do, and like Earthen Spike, which would be included in the macro, and they're going to work out just fine, of course. So the only other thing to talk about is this one here, Crashing Storm, which basically gives more oomph to your Crash Lightning, which kind of justifies it being in the macro a little bit more for single target and for AoE. This isn't necessarily the best talent to go with, but it is the easiest talent to go with, and that is the name of the game here when you're using macros with Gnome Sequencer. It's entirely up to you to not use this talent to take Crash Lightning out of your rotation. If you go with Fury of Air, for example, you're going to have to manage it separately. Of course, if you do take Sundering, the macro will manage that. But again, I go with this one because it makes it easier for me to play the class. And that's what I always go for. That's the priority here. Otherwise, there really isn't anything else to go over. As powerful as these macros are, they are far from perfect. So, if you want to play the game at a high level and get the most out of your class, I highly recommend that you play the game without these macros. But if you'd like to get started with Gnome Sequencer Enhanced, you can do so by downloading and installing the mod. A link can be found in the description below. Along with it, you will find paste-bin links for any macros featured in this video. If you'd like to use them, simply click the link and you'll be taken to a raw paste bin of the macro. Select the entire macro, copy, log into the appropriate class, type /GS to open the Gnome Sequencer screen, click on Import, paste the macro into the available space, make sure that Automatically Create Macro Icon is checked, and click Import. You can now drag the icon to your action bar and the macro is ready to be used. If you followed all the steps correctly, the macro should be working fine. If something isn't working, start over and make sure that you follow all the steps correctly. If you are having further issues, I recommend that you check out the mod page or contact the mod's author for more information. If you enjoyed this video, let me know by hitting that like button. And feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. You can also subscribe to the channel and follow me on Twitter at TheKephas to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. Thanks for watching, have a wonderful day, this is Kephas, until next time.